This fake passport is going straight in the trash where it belongs, and you can explain to the police why you thought you could fool a federal officer. Derek Washington's words echoed through Terminal 2 of Chicago O'Hare as he held the torn halves of what he believed was a counterfeit document, completely unaware that he had just destroyed the identification of the woman who owned every airplane in the terminal behind him. But let's start from the beginning, because this story isn't just about one moment of prejudice meeting its match. It's about how assumptions can destroy careers, how dignity can triumph over discrimination, and how sometimes the person you're treating like garbage has the power to change everything you thought you knew about consequence and redemption. The automatic glass doors of Chicago O'Hare Terminal 2 slid open with a mechanical whisper, releasing a gust of recycled air that carried the familiar airport cocktail of jet fuel coffee and 1,000 different stress hormones. Zara Mitchell pulled her worn Georgetown University hoodie tighter around her shoulders and adjusted the oversized sunglasses that had become her shield against the world that suddenly wanted to scrutinize her every move. At 31, she looked more like a graduate student heading home for winter break than the newly appointed CEO of Skyline Airways, and that was exactly the point. The hoodie wasn't a fashion statement, but a carefully chosen disguise, faded enough to suggest financial struggle, comfortable enough to blend into the sea of travelers who shuffled through these corridors every day with their rolling suitcases and their quiet desperation to get somewhere else. Zara had purchased it 3 years ago during the most difficult period of her life when she was completing her MBA while working 2 jobs and sending money home to help her father with medical bills. Now it served a different purpose entirely, allowing her to become invisible in a world where her face had recently been splashed across the covers of Forbes and Fortune under headlines that made her stomach clench with anxiety. She paused near a cluster of uncomfortable metal chairs, ostensibly checking her phone but actually studying the flow of passengers and staff around the Skyline Airways check-in counters. 3 months ago, the board of directors had reluctantly appointed her as CEO after a hostile takeover that left them with little choice, and their skepticism had been as subtle as a brick through a window. During her first board meeting, 70-year-old Harrison Webb had actually asked her if she was sure she wouldn't be more comfortable in a supporting role where she could learn the ropes before taking on such enormous responsibility. The memory still made her jaw tighten with suppressed anger. The decision to go undercover hadn't come from some elaborate corporate strategy session, but from a conversation with her father 3 weeks ago in the cramped kitchen of his Chicago bungalow. The same kitchen where she'd done her homework as a child while he fixed airplane engines in the backyard. Charles Mitchell had worked for various airlines for 35 years, and he knew the industry from the ground up in ways that no boardroom discussion could ever capture. The problem isn't at the top, baby girl, he'd said, stirring sugar into his coffee with the slow deliberation of a man who'd learned that wisdom comes from paying attention to details. The problem is in the middle with the people who have just enough power to make other folks miserable, but not enough sense to know when they're making the whole company look bad. Her father had told her stories over the years about the small humiliations and casual disrespect that passengers endured, particularly passengers who didn't fit the profile of what airline staff expected first-class customers to look like. He'd seen flight attendants ignore black passengers while fawning over white customers, watched gate agents treat elderly travelers like inconveniences rather than human beings, witnessed the 1,000 small cuts that turned air travel from a service into an endurance test. "You want to know why your customer satisfaction scores are in the toilet?" he'd asked, raising an eyebrow with the expression he'd worn when she was 12 and insisting she didn't need to study for a test. "Put on some old clothes and buy a ticket like everybody else. See how your own people treat you when they don't know who you are." The idea had terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure because Zara knew that her father was right about more than just customer service issues. Part of her had been running from the constant pressure of being seen as the diversity hire, the young black woman who couldn't possibly have earned her position through merit alone. Every decision she made was scrutinized, every mistake magnified, every success attributed to affirmative action rather than competence. Going undercover would strip away the protective barrier of her title and force her to experience her own company's culture without the deference that came with power. It would also give her the ammunition she needed to make changes that the board couldn't dismiss as oversensitivity or political correctness. So here she was, standing in her own terminal, carrying a battered duffel bag that had seen her through college and graduate school, with her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and her hands deliberately free of the designer jewelry that had become part of her corporate armor. She'd driven to the airport in her old Honda Civic instead of the company car, paid for her own parking, and bought her ticket using her personal credit card. The only concession to her actual position was the first-class seat to London, which she'd justified as necessary for the 8-hour flight, though she was already regretting the decision as she watched other passengers react to the obvious disconnect between her appearance and her boarding pass. The check-in line moved with the sluggish efficiency of government bureaucracy, and Zara found herself behind a young mother who was clearly struggling with a crying toddler, an overloaded stroller, and the kind of exhausted desperation that every parent recognized, but few people without children understood. The woman kept apologizing to everyone around her, as her son wailed and kicked his face red with the kind of outrage that only comes from being 2 years old and having no control over anything in your environment. Zara watched as other passengers rolled their eyes and muttered under their breath, and she felt the familiar surge of protective anger that had driven her to choose a career in business rather than the non-profit work her college advisors had suggested. When the mother reached the check-in counter, the Skyline Airways agent barely looked up from his computer screen, his fingers dancing across the keyboard with mechanical precision while the toddler's cries echoed through the terminal. Next, he called out before the woman had even finished gathering her documents, forcing her to juggle her child and her paperwork while other passengers pressed forward impatiently. Zara bit her tongue and forced herself to remain in character, even as every instinct screamed at her to intervene, to identify herself, to demand better treatment for a customer who was clearly doing her best in difficult circumstances. This was exactly what her father had been talking about, she realized. This casual indifference, this assumption that some passengers deserved basic courtesy while others were simply inconveniences to be processed as quickly as possible. She pulled out her phone and opened her notes app, typing quickly. Check-in staff training. Empathy protocols needed. Current approach treats customers like cattle, not human beings paying premium prices for service. It was going to be a long day, and they hadn't even reached security yet. The check-in process took 47 minutes, not because of any actual complications, but because the Skyline Airways staff seemed to operate under the assumption that efficiency was less important than maintaining their sense of authority over the passengers who needed their help. When Zara finally reached the counter, the agent's name tag identified him as Kevin, and his expression suggested that he'd rather be literally anywhere else on Earth than helping travelers navigate the complex process of getting from point A to point B. Kevin took her boarding pass and passport with the enthusiasm of someone handling contaminated evidence, holding them at arm's length while his eyes flicked between her face and her identification photo with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for criminal investigations. "First class," he said, and it wasn't a question, but an accusation wrapped in professional courtesy. "London Heathrow seat 2A. That's our premium service." He paused clearly, waiting for her to explain herself, to justify why someone who looked like she should be flying standby had somehow acquired a seat that cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Yes," Zara replied simply, offering him the kind of polite smile she'd perfected during years of corporate meetings where she'd been the only black face in a room full of white executives. "I'm looking forward to the flight." She kept her voice level and pleasant, giving him no excuse to escalate the situation, no reason to call for a supervisor or create the kind of scene that would compromise her mission before it had truly begun. Kevin's fingers hesitated over his keyboard, and she could practically see the wheels turning in his head as he tried to process the disconnect between her appearance and her ticket. Finally, he shrugged and printed her luggage tag with the kind of aggressive force that suggested he was imagining it was her face instead of a piece of paper. "Gate K14, he said, slapping the tag onto her duffel bag with unnecessary violence. "Security checkpoint is to your right. Try not to hold up the line." The dismissal was clear, but Zara had been dismissed by better people than Kevin, and she simply nodded and moved away from the counter. Her bag now officially checked and her boarding pass clutched in her hand, like a ticket to understanding what her customers really experienced when they flew Skyline Airways. She'd learned more in 47 minutes than 6 months of customer service reports had taught her, and the education was just beginning. The walk to the security checkpoint took her past a series of small interactions that she filed away for future reference. She watched a gate agent refuse to help an elderly man find his gate because information desks are clearly marked, saw a baggage handler literally throw a suitcase onto a cart while its owner watched in horror, and witnessed a customer service representative hang up on someone who was clearly in distress about a missed connection. Each incident was small, easily dismissed as isolated bad behavior or the result of a particularly stressful day, but together they painted a picture of a company culture that had forgotten the basic principle that customers were human beings, deserving of respect rather than obstacles to be overcome. But it was the encounter near the restrooms that really crystallized what her father had been trying to tell her. An older woman, probably in her 70s, was standing near the entrance to the ladies' room with tears streaming down her face and a crumpled piece of paper in her hands. Her Skyline Airways boarding pass had been damaged somehow, the barcode smeared beyond recognition, and she was clearly panicked about missing her flight. A supervisor-level employee was walking past his company lanyard, identifying him as someone with the authority to solve problems, and the woman reached out desperately to get his attention. "Excuse me," she said, her voice shaking with the kind of vulnerability that should have triggered every decent person's protective instincts. "My boarding pass got wet somehow, and I can't read the gate number. Could you please help me figure out where I need to go? I don't want to miss my flight to see my granddaughter." The supervisor glanced at her for exactly 3 seconds, took in her faded dress and practical shoes, and made a decision that revealed everything wrong with Skyline Airways' customer service philosophy. "Customer service desk is over there," he said, pointing vaguely toward the other side of the terminal without slowing his pace. "They'll sort you out." Then he was gone, leaving the elderly woman standing alone with her damaged boarding pass and her tears clearly overwhelmed by the prospect of navigating the maze of airport bureaucracy without help. Zara stood frozen for a moment, torn between her mission to observe and her basic human decency. The woman reminded her of her own grandmother, who had raised her while her parents worked multiple jobs to keep their family afloat, and who had died 2 years ago, still worrying about being a burden to anyone who tried to help her. Without conscious decision, Zara approached the woman and gently touched her arm. "Ma'am," she said softly, "I think I can help you with that. May I see your boarding pass?" The woman handed it over gratefully, and Zara studied the smudged print until she could make out enough information to identify the flight. "You're going to gate C7 and you have plenty of time. Would you like me to walk you over there?" The relief on the woman's face was so profound that Zara felt tears prick her own eyes. As they walked slowly through the terminal, the woman told her about her granddaughter's college graduation, about how she'd saved for 2 years to afford the trip, about how terrified she'd been that she would miss the most important day in her family's recent history because of a damaged piece of paper. "You're so kind, dear," she said as they reached her gate. "Most people are too busy to help an old lady figure out where she's going." Zara thought about the supervisor who had dismissed her about Kevin's barely concealed hostility about all the small cruelties she'd witnessed in less than 2 hours. "You deserve better than that," she said firmly. "Every passenger deserves better than that." The woman smiled and patted her hand, and Zara realized that she'd just received the most important lesson in customer service she'd ever experienced, not from a consultant or a training manual, but from seeing genuine human kindness in action. The TSA security checkpoint at Terminal 2 operated with the kind of grim efficiency that made passengers feel like potential criminals, rather than customers who had purchased the right to travel from one place to another. The blue uniformed officers moved through their routines with the mechanical precision of people who had performed the same tasks thousands of times, their faces masks of professional indifference that suggested they'd long ago stopped seeing the travelers they processed as individual human beings with their own stories, fears, and destinations. Derek Washington stood near the primary screening station, like a general surveying his battlefield, his massive frame and buzz-cut hair giving him the appearance of someone who had missed his calling in the military and found a substitute in airport security. At 45, he carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who had learned that respect was something you demanded rather than earned, and his eyes swept the crowd with the calculating gaze of someone looking for problems to solve rather than people to help. He'd been a TSA supervisor for 12 years, and in that time he'd developed a reputation for being thorough, uncompromising, and absolutely immune to sob stories, excuses, or attempts at intimidation. What the passengers moving through his checkpoint didn't know was that Derek Washington was fighting a war on multiple fronts, and most of those battles were taking place inside his own head. 3 months ago, he'd applied for promotion to Federal Air Marshal, a position that would have doubled his salary and given him the kind of respect he'd been craving since his divorce 2 years earlier. The rejection letter had been polite but devastating, citing his inflexible approach to passenger relations and suggesting that he might benefit from additional training in cultural sensitivity and de-escalation techniques. The words had burned in his mind like acid, particularly because they echoed similar criticisms from his ex-wife, his teenage daughter, and his former supervisor at the Chicago Police Department, where he'd worked for 8 years before a series of complaints about excessive force had encouraged him to seek employment elsewhere. The financial pressures weren't helping his state of mind. The child support payments to his ex-wife consumed most of his paycheck, leaving him living in a studio apartment on the South Side and driving a 12-year-old car that needed more repairs than he could afford. His daughter Keisha visited every other weekend, and he could see the disappointment in her eyes when she looked around his cramped living space, could hear the judgment in her voice when she compared his situation to her stepfather's comfortable suburban home. Derek had promised himself that he would provide better for his family. But at 45, his options seemed to be narrowing rather than expanding. The previous week had been particularly difficult. A well-dressed white teenager had triggered additional screening protocols because of some metallic threads in his designer jacket, and Derek had conducted a thorough search that revealed nothing more dangerous than expensive cologne and a smartphone that cost more than Derek made in a month. The kid's father turned out to be a prominent Chicago attorney who specialized in civil rights cases, and by the end of the day, Derek was sitting in his supervisor's office listening to a lecture about profiling appropriate procedures and the importance of treating all passengers with equal respect, regardless of their appearance or attitude. The irony wasn't lost on him. Derek had grown up in the same South Side neighborhoods where young black men were routinely harassed by police, and he'd joined law enforcement partly because he wanted to be one of the good guys, someone who protected people rather than preying on them. But somewhere along the way, the job had hardened him, and the constant stress of being responsible for everyone's safety while being criticized for every decision had turned him into exactly the kind of officer he'd once despised. He told himself that he was just being thorough, that his job was to catch problems before they became disasters, that passengers who complained about his methods didn't understand the risks he was responsible for managing. When Derek spotted Zara Mitchell approaching his checkpoint, his trained eyes immediately began cataloging details that didn't add up. The boarding pass in her hand showed first-class service to London, a ticket that typically cost between $8,000 and $12,000, depending on the season and availability. But everything else about her suggested someone who shopped at thrift stores and counted pennies from her faded hoodie to her worn sneakers to the duffel bag that looked like it had survived several years of college dormitory abuse. In Derek's experience, people who could afford premium airline tickets didn't dress like graduate students, and people who dressed like graduate students didn't typically have access to the kind of money required for international first-class travel. He'd seen this pattern before, or thought he had. Fraudulent tickets purchased with stolen credit cards, employees abusing their travel benefits, occasional passengers who'd won contests or received upgrades and didn't understand that certain standards of behavior and appearance were expected in premium cabins. Last month, he'd caught a woman trying to board with a first-class ticket that turned out to be expertly forged, and his supervisor had praised his attention to detail. The month before that, a teenager had tried to use his older brother's identification to board a flight to Miami, and Derek's careful questioning had uncovered the deception before the kid could disappear into the airport. But there was something else driving Derek's suspicions, something he wouldn't have admitted to anyone and barely acknowledged to himself. The combination of Zara's race and her apparent economic status triggered assumptions that he'd learned growing up in a neighborhood where success was viewed with suspicion and where any black person who seemed to be doing too well was automatically suspect. He'd internalized the toxic idea that there were certain spaces where people who looked like him didn't belong, and when he saw Zara with her expensive ticket and her humble appearance, his brain automatically jumped to the conclusion that something fraudulent was happening. As she stepped up to his podium, Derek felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with the possibility of uncovering deception, of proving his worth through careful attention to details that other officers might miss. He didn't see Zara Mitchell, successful business executive, conducting important research. He saw a puzzle that didn't fit together a problem that needed to be solved, a potential threat to the security and integrity of the aviation industry, and he was absolutely certain that his experience and training had given him the tools necessary to figure out what was really going on. "Next," Derek called out. Though Zara was already stepping forward with her boarding pass and passport ready, her movements calm and deliberate in the way of someone who had traveled extensively and understood airport protocols. She offered him a polite smile, the kind of professional courtesy that came naturally after years of navigating corporate environments where every interaction was a potential minefield of racial and gender dynamics. Derek accepted her documents without returning the smile, his attention immediately focused on the boarding pass that revealed information he found deeply suspicious. "First class to London," he said, holding the paper up to the light as if he might discover hidden messages in the printing. "Seat 2A. That's premium service." His tone carried an undertone of skepticism that made several passengers in line behind Zara exchange uncomfortable glances. "Yes, sir," Zara replied evenly, maintaining eye contact without appearing defiant. A delicate balance she'd learned through countless interactions with authority figures who seemed determined to find fault with her presence in spaces they considered inappropriate for someone who looked like her. "I'm looking forward to the flight." Derek flipped open her passport, comparing the photo to her face with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for international border crossings rather than domestic security checkpoints. The document was clearly genuine, with all the proper security features and none of the obvious signs of tampering that characterized most fraudulent identification. But something about the situation continued to gnaw at his professional instincts. "What's the purpose of your travel?" He asked a question that wasn't part of standard TSA protocols, but which he justified to himself as necessary due diligence. Business Zara answered, simply offering no additional details that might complicate the interaction or provide ammunition for further questioning. She could feel the eyes of other passengers on her, could sense the familiar mixture of curiosity and discomfort that accompanied any situation where a black person was being subjected to additional scrutiny by law enforcement. A middle-aged white businessman behind her checked his watch loudly and sighed, clearly irritated by what he perceived as an unnecessary delay. What kind of business? Derek pressed his voice, taking on the aggressive edge that had earned him complaints in the past, but which he continued to use because it often revealed deception in people who were trying to hide something from him. "You work for a company that sends employees to London first class, or is this some kind of personal trip that you're calling business for tax purposes?" The question crossed several lines of appropriate professional conduct, but Zara recognized that challenging Derek's authority at this point would only escalate a situation that was already attracting unwanted attention. "I work in corporate consulting," she said, which was technically true given that her role as CEO often involved consulting with other executives about industry best practices. "I'm attending meetings with potential clients." Derek studied her face for several long seconds, looking for the telltale signs of deception that his training had taught him to recognize. But Zara's expression remained perfectly calm, and her story was vague enough to be believable, while specific enough to suggest that she wasn't simply making things up on the spot. Still, something about the entire situation felt wrong to him, like a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit together no matter how hard he tried to force them into place. "Corporate consulting," he repeated slowly, as if testing the words for authenticity. "And these clients of yours, they're paying for first-class travel for someone who looks like she shops at Goodwill." The insult was delivered with enough plausible deniability that Zara couldn't call him on it directly, but the meaning was clear to everyone within earshot. Behind her, an elderly woman muttered something under her breath about respect and proper treatment, while the businessman continued to demonstrate his impatience through increasingly dramatic gestures. A young woman with purple hair pulled out her phone and began recording discreetly, sensing that the interaction was moving beyond normal security procedures into something more problematic. Zara felt heat rising in her cheeks, but she forced herself to maintain her composure, knowing that any display of anger or frustration would be used as evidence that she was the problem, rather than Derek's increasingly inappropriate behavior. "I believe my appearance and my travel arrangements are my own business, Officer Washington," she said quietly, reading his name tag. "Is there anything specific about my documentation that concerns you?" The use of his name seemed to catch Derek off guard momentarily, and he realized that their conversation was being observed and possibly recorded by other passengers. He was walking a fine line between thorough security procedures and harassment, and his supervisor's warnings about passenger complaints echoed in his mind. But his pride and his conviction that something was wrong with this situation prevented him from backing down. "Everything about your documentation concerns me," Derek said, raising his voice enough to establish his authority for the benefit of the crowd. "First-class tickets to international destinations don't grow on trees, and people who can afford them usually look like they can afford them. You want to convince me this is legitimate, you're going to need to provide some additional information about how you acquired this ticket." The demand was clearly outside the scope of TSA authority, but Derek counted on most passengers being intimidated enough by his uniform and his aggressive demeanor to comply with whatever he asked, rather than risk missing their flights. He'd used similar tactics hundreds of times before, and they usually worked because people were more concerned with getting through security than with standing on principle. But as Derek stared into Zara's eyes, he saw something that he hadn't expected. Instead of fear or defensiveness, he saw the kind of calm confidence that came from someone who was accustomed to being challenged and who had learned how to handle confrontations without losing her dignity. It was the expression of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she was worth, regardless of what other people thought about her appearance or her right to occupy certain spaces. "Officer Washington Zara," said her voice carrying a note of steel that made Derek's supervisor, who had been watching the interaction from across the checkpoint, begin walking in their direction. "I've provided you with valid identification and a legitimate boarding pass. If you have specific security concerns about my documentation, I'd be happy to speak with your supervisor about proper procedures for addressing them." Derek's jaw tightened at the suggestion that he might need supervision to handle what he considered a routine security matter, and the approach of his boss only intensified his determination to prove that his suspicions were justified. Supervisor Lisa Martinez had been riding him for months about passenger relations, constantly lecturing him about sensitivity and appropriate procedures, as if he were some rookie who didn't understand the complexities of airport security. The last thing he needed was another conversation about his methods, especially in front of a growing crowd of travelers who were already questioning his authority. "I don't need my supervisor to spot a fake ticket," Derek said loudly enough for Martinez to hear as she approached his voice carrying the kind of defensive aggression that had characterized most of his interactions with authority figures since his divorce. "I've been doing this job for 12 years, and I know fraudulent documentation when I see it." Zara felt a chill of recognition as Derek's behavior shifted from suspicious questioning to outright hostility. She'd seen this pattern before in boardrooms and corporate meetings where insecure men felt threatened by her presence and responded by trying to diminish her credibility through increasingly aggressive challenges to her qualifications, her background, her right to be present in professional spaces. The difference here was that Derek had the power of a federal badge behind his insecurity, and the stakes were considerably higher than a difficult meeting or an uncomfortable conversation with colleagues. "Sir," she said, carefully modulating her voice to project calm authority without triggering his obviously fragile ego. "I understand that you take security seriously, and I appreciate the important work that you do to keep travelers safe. However, I've complied with all standard screening procedures, and I'd like to continue to my gate if there are no specific security concerns that require additional attention." The reasonable tone of her response only seemed to inflame Derek's suspicions further, because, in his experience, guilty people often tried to sound cooperative and professional when they were attempting to talk their way out of legitimate scrutiny. He'd heard similar speeches from con artists, credit card fraudsters, and identity thieves who thought they could use polite language and confident demeanor to avoid the consequences of their criminal behavior. "Your ticket doesn't match your appearance," Derek said, bluntly abandoning any pretense of diplomatic language in favor of direct confrontation. "First-class passengers don't dress like they just rolled out of bed, and they don't carry luggage that looks like it survived a war zone. Either you stole this ticket, someone else bought it for you under circumstances I'm pretty sure we'd both prefer not to discuss, or you're running some kind of scam that I haven't figured out yet." The accusations were so far beyond appropriate professional conduct that Martinez accelerated her approach, but Derek was too focused on his confrontation with Zara to notice his supervisor's increasingly urgent gestures. Behind Zara, the line of passengers had grown increasingly restless, with several people openly filming the interaction and others muttering complaints about the delay. The elderly woman who had been sympathetic earlier now looked genuinely distressed, while the businessman had started making phone calls to complain about missing his connection. Zara felt the familiar surge of anger that accompanied being publicly humiliated by someone who had decided that her appearance was incompatible with her accomplishments. But she also recognized that Derek's behavior was revealing exactly the kind of cultural problems that she'd come here to investigate. This wasn't just one officer having a bad day. This was the result of training policies and institutional attitudes that encouraged security personnel to make assumptions about passengers based on race, class, and appearance, rather than actual security concerns. "Officer Washington," she said, her voice carrying a warning that Derek was too angry to recognize, "I want to be very clear about what's happening here. You are accusing me of criminal activity based on your personal opinion about how someone with my ticket should look. You have no evidence of wrongdoing, no legitimate security concerns, and no authority to detain me based on your assumptions about my economic status or my right to purchase premium airline services." The speech was delivered with the kind of precision that came from years of legal training and corporate negotiations, and it had the effect of making Derek realize that he was dealing with someone considerably more sophisticated than the typical passenger who moved through his checkpoint. But instead of backing down, he doubled down on his aggressive approach, convinced that Zara's articulate response was evidence of preparation rather than education. "Don't try to lawyer me," Lady Derek snapped, his voice rising to a level that attracted attention from across the security area. I've dealt with plenty of people who think they can talk their way out of legitimate questioning by using fancy words and threatening complaints. Your documentation is suspicious. Your story doesn't add up, and I'm going to examine every piece of paper you're carrying until I figure out what's really going on here. He reached for her passport with more force than necessary, his movements aggressive enough to make several passengers step back instinctively. Zara watched his face as he handled her identification, seeing the mixture of frustration and determination that drove men like Derek to prove their authority through increasingly extreme measures. She recognized the moment when reasonable disagreement transformed into something more dangerous, the point where pride and prejudice combined to create situations that couldn't be resolved through rational conversation. Sir Martinez called out finally, close enough to intervene, but Derek was already past the point where outside voices could penetrate his focus. He held Zara's passport up to the light, examining it with exaggerated care, looking for any imperfection that might justify his suspicions. The document was perfect, of course, because it was genuine, but Derek had convinced himself that sophisticated forgeries could fool casual inspection. The lamination is loose around the edges, he announced triumphantly, though the passport showed no such damage. And the photo looks like it might have been altered. This is definitely suspicious enough to warrant confiscation pending further investigation. He was making it up as he went along, but his voice carried enough official authority to make some of the watching passengers nod in agreement. Zara knew that she had reached a decision point. She could reveal her identity and end the confrontation immediately, but doing so would compromise her investigation and rob her of the credibility she needed to make changes based on first-hand experience rather than second-hand reports. Alternatively, she could continue to endure Derek's harassment and document every aspect of his behavior for future training and disciplinary purposes, but that approach carried the risk that his aggression might escalate into something even more damaging. "Officer Washington," she said quietly, her voice carrying an undertone of finality that Derek should have recognized as a warning. "If you damage federal property based on false accusations, you will face consequences that extend far beyond anything your supervisor might have planned for you. I strongly suggest that you return my passport and allow me to proceed to my gate." But Derek Washington was too far down the path of his own self-destruction to turn back now, and Zara Mitchell was about to learn exactly how far prejudice and insecurity could drive a man who had confused authority with power and respect with fear. The sound of tearing paper cut through the ambient noise of the security checkpoint, like a gunshot followed by a collective gasp from the passengers who had been watching Derek Washington's increasingly erratic behavior with growing alarm. He held the two halves of Zara's passport in his hands like trophies, his chest heaving with the adrenaline rush that came from what he believed was a decisive victory over someone who had tried to challenge his authority with fraudulent documentation. "There," Derek said triumphantly, his voice carrying across the checkpoint with the kind of satisfaction that came from proving himself right after being questioned by someone he considered unqualified to judge his professional competence. "Now it's definitely invalid. You can't travel internationally with a damaged passport, and attempting to use forged federal documents is a felony that carries serious prison time." Zara stared at the destroyed passport in Derek's hands, feeling a strange sense of detachment as she processed what had just happened. In all her years of corporate battles, hostile negotiations, and bureaucratic warfare, she had never encountered someone so committed to his own prejudices that he would commit a federal crime in full view of dozens of witnesses rather than admit that he might have made an error in judgment. The torn passport represented more than just inconvenience. It was a symbol of every assumption, every microaggression, every moment when someone had looked at her and decided that she didn't belong in spaces they considered their own. "You just destroyed federal property," Zara said quietly, her voice carrying a calm certainty that should have warned Derek that he had crossed a line from which there would be no return. In front of all these witnesses on camera, because you decided that someone who looks like me couldn't possibly have earned the right to travel in first class. Derek laughed a harsh sound that revealed how far he had traveled from reasonable law enforcement into something resembling a power trip fueled by personal insecurity and racial prejudice. "Save the civil rights speech for someone who cares," he said, tossing the torn passport pieces onto the metal table with casual dismissal. "I've heard it all before from people who think they can cry discrimination every time they get caught breaking the law." Behind Zara, the crowd of passengers had grown larger and more agitated, with several people openly recording the interaction, while others called for security supervisors to intervene. Martinez was pushing through the crowd now, her face pale with the realization that her most problematic officer had just created a public relations nightmare that would require immediate damage control and probably federal investigation. But Zara wasn't focused on the crowd or the approaching supervisor. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found the number she needed. The action seemed to amuse Derek, who interpreted it as a desperate attempt to call a lawyer or file a complaint that he was confident would be dismissed once the facts of the case were properly explained to his superiors. "Go ahead and call whoever you want," Derek said with the arrogance of someone who had convinced himself that his badge would protect him from any consequences. "Call the airport police, call the FBI, call your congressman if you think it'll help. I'm a federal officer doing my job, and destroying suspicious documentation is well within my authority." Zara dialed a number from her favorites list, and the call was answered on the first ring. "This is James Park," said a deep voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to handling emergencies for powerful people. James was Skyline Airways' head of security, a former Secret Service agent who had spent 15 years protecting presidents and cabinet members before transitioning to corporate security work. James, Zara said calmly, her eyes never leaving Derek's face. "I'm at Terminal 2 TSA Checkpoint Delta. I need you to bring airport police and the federal marshal. Also, call the airport director and tell them we have a situation that's going to require immediate executive attention." Derek's confident smirk began to falter as he listened to Zara's side of the conversation, particularly when she mentioned federal marshals and airport directors. Those weren't the kind of people that typical passengers had on speed dial, and the casual authority in her voice suggested connections that extended far beyond what he had assumed about her background and resources. "Yes, Ms. Mitchell," James replied, and Derek felt his stomach drop as he heard the respectful tone in the security chief's voice. "I'll be there in 3 minutes with a full team. Should I contact legal as well?" "Definitely," Zara said, still maintaining eye contact with Derek, who was now beginning to understand that he had made a catastrophic error in judgment. "And James, make sure someone calls the pilot of Flight 447 and tells him we'll be delayed but not to give away my seat. I still intend to make this trip, just not exactly the way I originally planned." Derek's face had gone pale as the implications of the conversation began to sink in. Passengers didn't have airport directors on speed dial unless they were considerably more important than their appearance suggested, and security chiefs didn't address regular travelers with the kind of deference he'd just heard in James Park's voice. The pieces of the puzzle he'd been so confident about solving were rearranging themselves into a picture that made him feel physically sick. "Who are you?" Derek asked quietly, his earlier aggression replaced by growing dread as he realized that his assumption about Zara's identity and status might have been spectacularly wrong. Zara slipped her phone back into her pocket and looked at Derek with the kind of calm assessment that corporate executives reserved for employees who had just demonstrated their unsuitability for continued employment. "I'm someone who just learned more about my company's customer service problems in 10 minutes than 6 months of reports could have taught me," she said. "And you, Officer Washington, are about to discover what happens when prejudice meets consequence." From across the checkpoint, James Park was approaching with a team that included 2 airport police officers, a federal air marshal, and a woman in an expensive suit who carried herself with the unmistakable authority of senior management. Supervisor Martinez had finally reached the scene and was staring at the torn passport pieces with the expression of someone who realized that her career was about to become considerably more complicated. Derek Washington stood in the middle of the expanding chaos, still holding the pieces of destroyed federal property, beginning to understand that his confidence in his own judgment and his faith in his authority were about to be tested in ways he had never imagined possible. 2 hours later, Zara Mitchell walked down the jet bridge toward Skyline Airways Flight 447 with her backup diplomatic passport in hand and a recording device discreetly activated in her pocket, ready to document whatever additional customer service failures awaited her at 35,000 feet. The confrontation with Derek Washington had been resolved with surgical efficiency by James Park and the airport authorities, but Zara knew that the TSA checkpoint was only the beginning of her investigation into the cultural problems that were destroying her company's reputation, one passenger at a time. Derek was currently sitting in an airport holding cell, facing federal charges for destruction of government property and civil rights violations, his 12-year career in ruins because he had allowed his prejudices to override his professional judgment. The irony wasn't lost on Zara that a man who had spent his career claiming to protect airline security had just demonstrated exactly the kind of behavior that made air travel feel unsafe and unwelcoming for passengers who didn't fit narrow demographic profiles. But as she approached the aircraft door, Zara reminded herself that her mission was far from complete. She had deliberately chosen to continue with her original flight plan rather than taking the corporate jet that James had offered because she needed to experience the full spectrum of customer service that Skyline Airways provided to passengers who weren't protected by executive privilege. The TSA incident had already provided her with ammunition for massive policy changes, but she suspected that the real problems lay deeper in the company culture among employees who had never received proper training about dignity, respect, and the basic principle that every passenger deserved courteous treatment, regardless of their appearance or background. Standing at the aircraft entrance was Thomas Rivera, the head flight attendant, whose name tag identified him as the purser responsible for first-class service on the 8-hour flight to London. At 47 years old, Thomas carried himself with the kind of professional bearing that suggested extensive experience in luxury hospitality, his uniform perfectly pressed, and his silver hair styled with the attention to detail that first-class passengers expected from premium airline service. But as his eyes took in Zara's casual clothing and worn duffel bag, his expression shifted from professional welcome to barely concealed skepticism. Thomas had worked his way up through the airline industry over the course of 23 years, starting as a baggage handler and eventually earning his position as senior cabin crew through determination, skill, and an unwavering commitment to maintaining the standards that separated premium service from ordinary commercial travel. He took pride in his ability to read passengers, to understand their expectations and preferences before they even articulated them, and to provide the kind of personalized attention that justified the premium prices that first-class customers paid for their tickets. But Thomas also carried the burden of working-class origins that had taught him to view success with suspicion, particularly when that success seemed to come too easily, or to people who hadn't obviously earned it through the kind of struggle he had experienced. He had grown up in a neighborhood where anyone who seemed to be doing too well was automatically suspect, and where the general assumption was that there were certain spaces and privileges that weren't meant for people who looked like they came from backgrounds similar to his own. "Good evening," Thomas said with professional courtesy, extending his hand to accept Zara's boarding pass while his eyes continued to catalog details that didn't align with his expectations for first-class passengers. "Welcome aboard Skyline Airways Flight 447 to London Heathrow." Zara handed him her boarding pass and noticed the way his eyebrows rose slightly as he read the seat assignment. "Seat 2. Thomas said, and she could hear the question in his voice, even though he was too professional to voice it directly. "Our premium suite service. I trust you'll find everything to your satisfaction." "I'm sure I will," Zara replied, with the kind of polite confidence that had served her well in countless business situations where her presence was questioned but her qualifications were unassailable. She stepped into the first-class cabin, immediately noting the luxurious appointments that justified the premium pricing lie-flat seats that converted into beds personal entertainment systems with large screens and ambient lighting designed to create an atmosphere of exclusive comfort. There were only 6 other passengers in the first-class cabin, and Zara could feel their eyes on her as she located her seat and began to stow her belongings. The other travelers looked exactly like what central casting would order for a premium airline commercial, well-dressed professionals in expensive clothes carrying designer luggage, their appearances carefully curated to project success and sophistication. Zara's hoodie and duffel bag marked her as an obvious outsider in this carefully controlled environment. As she settled into seat 2, Zara noticed Thomas whispering with another flight attendant, a younger woman whose name tag identified her as Jessica. Their conversation was too quiet for her to hear, but their body language suggested that they were discussing something they found problematic about her presence in the cabin. Thomas kept glancing in her direction while Jessica shook her head with the kind of disapproval that suggested they were questioning whether Zara belonged in first class. "Excuse me," came a voice from across the aisle, and Zara looked up to see an elderly woman with kind eyes and perfectly styled white hair. "I'm Eleanor Walsh, and I couldn't help but notice that you seem to be traveling alone. Is this your first time in first class?" The question could have been condescending, but Eleanor's tone was genuinely warm, and Zara sensed that the older woman was simply trying to be friendly rather than challenging her right to occupy premium seating. "Thank you for asking," Zara replied with a smile. "I don't fly first class very often, so I'm looking forward to experiencing the service." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "Well, you've chosen an excellent airline. I've been flying with Skyline for 30 years, and Thomas provides wonderful service. He'll take very good care of you." She paused, then added with a slight frown, "Although I must say the younger crew members don't always seem to have the same attention to detail that the experienced staff provides." From the galley area, Zara could hear Thomas giving instructions to the other flight attendants, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned his position through years of experience and who expected his team to maintain the standards he had established. But she also detected an undertone of irritation that suggested he was dealing with something he considered problematic, and she had a strong suspicion that she was the source of his concern. As the boarding process continued, Zara observed the interactions between the crew and the other first-class passengers, noting the immediate attention and deferential service that was provided to travelers who looked the part of premium customers. Thomas personally greeted each passenger, addressing them by name and asking about their preferences for drinks and meal service. Jessica moved through the cabin with warm towels, newspapers, and amenities that were offered with genuine enthusiasm. But when it came time for pre-flight beverage service, something interesting happened. Thomas made his way through the cabin with a silver tray of champagne and premium spirits, stopping at every seat except Zara's. The omission was so obvious that Eleanor Walsh noticed it and shot a disapproving look in Thomas's direction, but he seemed oblivious to her concern as he continued his service routine. Zara pressed her call button and waited. Jessica appeared a moment later, her expression polite but noticeably cooler than the warmth she had shown to other passengers. "Yes?" she asked, without offering any of the courtesies that typically accompanied first-class service. "Could I possibly get a glass of water?" Zara asked pleasantly, testing whether the omission had been accidental or deliberate. "We'll be starting beverage service shortly after takeoff," Jessica replied without making eye contact. "Please wait until we're airborne." Eleanor Walsh leaned across the aisle. "Excuse me, dear," she said to Jessica with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard, "but I believe beverage service has already started. Mr. Harrison in 1A is enjoying a scotch, and the gentleman in 3B has champagne. Surely you could bring this young lady a glass of water." Jessica's face flushed slightly at being called out by a passenger, particularly one whose frequent flyer status and long relationship with the airline commanded respect. "Of course," she said tightly. "I'll bring that right away." But the damage was already done, and Zara realized that she was about to spend the next 8 hours discovering exactly how Skyline Airways treated customers who didn't meet their unstated criteria for premium service. The education was going to be expensive, uncomfortable, and probably infuriating, but she was grimly determined to experience every moment of it so that she could make the changes necessary to ensure that no other passenger would be subjected to the kind of discrimination she was already experiencing. 3 hours into the flight, the discrimination had evolved from subtle to blatant, and Zara found herself documenting a master class in how customer service could be weaponized to punish passengers who didn't conform to staff expectations about who deserved premium treatment. Thomas Rivera had transformed from professional flight attendant into passive-aggressive gatekeeper, using every tool at his disposal to make it clear that Zara's presence in first class was unwelcome and inappropriate. The meal service had been particularly educational. While other passengers were presented with elaborate descriptions of their dining options and encouraged to customize their orders according to personal preferences, Zara was simply informed that the chicken was available and that vegetarian alternatives weren't practical to prepare on short notice. When she politely asked about the beef option that had been enthusiastically described to the passenger across the aisle, Thomas explained that premium selections were reserved for our most frequent travelers and suggested that she might be more comfortable with the standard meal service provided to economy passengers. Eleanor Walsh had watched these interactions with increasing indignation, and during a quiet moment when Thomas was busy in the galley, she leaned over to speak with Zara directly. "My dear," she said in a low voice that carried decades of experience dealing with discrimination in various forms. "I've been flying first class since before that young man was born, and what he's doing to you is absolutely unacceptable. This isn't about meal availability or frequent flyer status. This is about prejudice, plain and simple." "Thank you for saying that," Zara replied quietly, grateful for the validation from someone whose status as a longtime premium customer gave her observations particular weight. "I was beginning to wonder if I was being too sensitive about the treatment." Eleanor shook her head firmly. "You're not being sensitive at all. You're being discriminated against, and it's disgraceful behavior that reflects poorly on this entire airline. I intend to file a complaint with management as soon as we land." She paused, studying Zara's face with the shrewd assessment of someone who had spent decades evaluating people in professional settings. "You carry yourself like someone who's accustomed to being in charge. What line of work are you in?" The question presented Zara with an interesting dilemma. She could continue to maintain her cover, which was already compromised by the TSA incident and the obvious attention from James Park's security team, or she could trust Eleanor with information that might prove useful in documenting the discrimination she was experiencing. "I work in airline management," she said carefully. "I'm traveling to London for meetings about customer service protocols." Eleanor's eyes sharpened with interest. "How fascinating. Then you're seeing firsthand exactly the kind of problems that need to be addressed in this industry." She glanced toward the galley where Thomas was visible through the open curtain. "I hope you'll have the opportunity to share your observations with people who have the authority to make changes." Before Zara could respond, Thomas emerged from the galley carrying a tray of hot towels for passenger refreshment, a standard amenity that was typically offered every few hours during long-haul flights. Once again, he made his way through the cabin, providing service to every passenger except Zara, the omission so deliberate that even other passengers began to notice the pattern of discrimination. "Excuse me," called out the businessman in seat 3B, a distinguished-looking man whose expensive watch and tailored clothing suggested significant wealth and influence. "I think you missed the young lady in 2A." Thomas paused, his professional facade slipping slightly as he was forced to acknowledge his deliberate exclusion of Zara from standard service protocols. "We're conserving towels due to supply constraints," he said smoothly, offering the kind of plausible explanation that was difficult to challenge directly, but which everyone present recognized as nonsense. The businessman frowned. Supply constraints. You just gave me a second towel because I mentioned that my hands felt dry. Surely you can spare one for a fellow first-class passenger. The confrontation was exactly what Thomas had been trying to avoid, because it forced him to choose between maintaining his discrimination against Zara and openly defying a high-status passenger who was calling him out for unprofessional behavior. His face flushed with embarrassment as he realized that his prejudice had been exposed in front of witnesses who couldn't be intimidated or dismissed. Of course, Thomas said, tightly retrieving a towel from his tray and offering it to Zara with the enthusiasm of someone handling contaminated evidence. My apologies for the oversight. Zara accepted the towel with gracious dignity, but she could see the anger burning in Thomas's eyes at being forced to provide her with service that he considered inappropriate for someone of her appearance and perceived social status. She realized that the confrontation had escalated beyond mere poor customer service into something more personal and potentially dangerous. 20 minutes later, the situation reached its breaking point. Thomas approached Zara's seat, carrying a glass of tomato juice on a tray, ostensibly offering her a beverage that she hadn't requested, but which he explained was complimentary for all first-class passengers. As he leaned over to place the drink on her tray table, the aircraft encountered a minor bump of turbulence, the kind of insignificant movement that experienced flight crew handled routinely without spilling anything. But instead of steadying the glass or waiting for the movement to pass, Thomas allowed the tomato juice to splash across Zara's lap and notebook, the red liquid soaking through her clothing and destroying the notes she had been taking about the discrimination she was experiencing. The accident was so obviously deliberate that several passengers gasped audibly, and Eleanor Walsh immediately reached for her call button. "Oh my goodness," Thomas said with exaggerated concern, his voice carrying the kind of false sympathy that fooled no one. "I'm so sorry about that. Turbulence can be so unpredictable. Let me get you some napkins to clean up." But as he reached for napkins from the galley, Thomas's expression shifted into something resembling satisfaction, and Zara realized that the beverage incident had been carefully planned as retaliation for the earlier confrontation about towel service. She was sitting in first-class seating covered in tomato juice, her dignity deliberately undermined by a flight attendant who had decided that humiliating her was more important than maintaining professional standards. "That was no accident," Eleanor Walsh said loudly enough for the entire cabin to hear her voice carrying the moral authority of someone who had witnessed injustice and refused to remain silent. "That was a deliberate attack on this passenger, and I demand that you call the captain immediately." Thomas's facade finally cracked completely. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset about the spill, but accidents happen during flights and making accusations against crew members is inappropriate. Perhaps you should focus on enjoying your own flight experience rather than involving yourself in situations that don't concern you." The dismissal of Eleanor Walsh was the final mistake Thomas could afford to make because she was exactly the kind of influential passenger whose complaints carried weight with airline management and whose loyalty was worth millions of dollars in revenue over the course of her relationship with Skyline Airways. But more importantly, she was a witness whose testimony would be impossible to dismiss or discredit. Eleanor stood up from her seat with the dignity of someone who had spent decades fighting discrimination in various forms and who wasn't about to allow it to continue on her watch. "Young man," she said in a voice that carried absolute moral authority, "I have been flying with this airline for 30 years. And I have never seen such disgraceful behavior from any crew member. You have deliberately discriminated against this passenger, denied her standard service, and now physically assaulted her with a beverage. This is criminal behavior, and I will personally ensure that it has consequences." The confrontation in the first-class cabin had attracted attention from passengers throughout the aircraft, and word of the incident quickly spread to the flight deck where Captain Maria Santos was monitoring the situation through reports from her cabin crew supervisor. As a 20-year veteran of commercial aviation and one of the first Latina pilots to achieve captain status with a major airline, Santos understood exactly how discrimination could poison the atmosphere of a flight and create situations that threatened both passenger safety and company reputation. Thomas, she said over the intercom, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who commanded a crew of 12 and bore ultimate responsibility for everyone aboard her aircraft. Please report to the flight deck immediately. Jessica will assume purser duties for the remainder of the flight. The announcement sent a visible shock through Thomas, who had apparently convinced himself that his behavior toward Zara would be overlooked or dismissed as a misunderstanding rather than recognized as the pattern of discrimination that it clearly represented. His face went pale as he realized that his actions were being investigated by the captain herself, and that his position as senior cabin crew offered no protection against the consequences of his prejudice and unprofessional conduct. As Thomas made his way toward the front of the aircraft, Eleanor Walsh stood up and began addressing the other first-class passengers with the kind of moral authority that came from witnessing injustice and refusing to remain silent about it. Ladies and gentlemen, she said clearly, what we have just witnessed is systematic discrimination against a fellow passenger based on her appearance and perceived social status. This young woman has been denied standard service, excluded from normal courtesies, and finally assaulted with a beverage in what was obviously a deliberate attack. The businessman in 3B nodded in agreement. I saw the whole thing, he said, pulling out his phone to check his recording of the incident. There was no turbulence when he spilled that drink. It was completely intentional, and frankly, it was disgusting behavior that reflects poorly on this entire airline. Other passengers began sharing their own observations about Thomas's treatment of Zara, creating a chorus of witness testimony that would be impossible for airline management to dismiss or minimize. The woman in seat 1C mentioned the deliberate omission of beverage service, while the couple in 4A described the discriminatory meal service they had observed. Even passengers who hadn't been paying close attention to the situation began to recall incidents that they now recognized as part of a pattern of harassment. Meanwhile, on the flight deck, Captain Santos was conducting a preliminary interview with Thomas that was being recorded as part of standard procedure for any incident involving crew misconduct. Thomas, she said, with professional calm, I need you to explain your interactions with the passenger in seat 2A. I've received multiple reports of discriminatory behavior, and I want to hear your side of the story before we land, and this becomes a matter for ground authorities. Thomas attempted to maintain his innocence, claiming that any appearance of discrimination was the result of misunderstandings and coincidences rather than deliberate action. Captain, I've been providing first-class service for 15 years, and I've never had complaints about discriminatory treatment. The passenger in 2A seemed uncomfortable with our normal protocols, and I was trying to accommodate her preferences while maintaining standards for our other customers. But his explanations fell apart under questioning, particularly when Santos asked him to account for the specific incidents that had been reported by Eleanor Walsh and other witnesses. The beverage service omissions, the meal service discrimination, the towel incident, and finally the tomato juice accident created a pattern that couldn't be explained away as misunderstanding or coincidence. Thomas Captain Santos said, with the finality of someone who had made a difficult but necessary decision, you are being relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight. When we land at Heathrow, you will be escorted off the aircraft by company security and placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation of your conduct. I want you to understand that discrimination against passengers is not only against company policy, but potentially criminal behavior that could result in federal charges. Back in the first-class cabin, Zara was dealing with the aftermath of the tomato juice incident while trying to maintain her composure and continue documenting the experience for her investigation. Jessica had provided her with napkins and club soda to clean up the stain, along with an apologetic explanation that Thomas's behavior didn't represent the values of Skyline Airways or the standards that the crew was trained to maintain. Ma'am, Jessica said quietly, kneeling beside Zara's seat to speak privately. I want you to know that what happened here today is completely unacceptable, and it doesn't reflect the way this airline normally treats passengers. Thomas has been under a lot of stress lately, but that's no excuse for discriminatory behavior. Zara appreciated Jessica's attempt to distance the crew from Thomas's actions, but she also recognized that the discrimination she had experienced wasn't the result of one individual having a bad day. It was the product of training policies and cultural attitudes that allowed prejudice to flourish as long as it was expressed subtly enough to maintain plausible deniability. "Thank you for saying that," Zara replied. "I hope this incident leads to better training and clearer policies about treating all passengers with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance or background." Eleanor Walsh had returned to her seat, but continued to monitor the situation with the protective attention of someone who had appointed herself as Zara's advocate and witness. "My dear," she said during a quiet moment, "I want you to know that I intend to pursue this matter with the highest levels of airline management. What happened to you today was an assault, and it cannot be allowed to go unpunished or ignored." As the aircraft began its descent toward London, Heathrow, Zara reflected on the 8 hours of education she had received about her own company's culture and customer service standards. The TSA incident had been shocking in its blatant prejudice and criminal behavior, but the flight crew discrimination had been more insidious and arguably more damaging because it represented institutional acceptance of prejudice as long as it was expressed with sufficient subtlety. The pilot's announcement about their final approach interrupted her thoughts, and Zara realized that she was about to face a reception committee that would include James Park British authorities and probably media representatives who had gotten word about the TSA incident. Her undercover investigation was about to become very public, and the changes she planned to implement at Skyline Airways would be scrutinized by an industry that desperately needed examples of how to address discrimination and improve customer service. But as she felt the wheels touch down on the runway at Heathrow, Zara was filled with a sense of purpose rather than dread because she finally understood exactly what needed to be changed and had the evidence necessary to make those changes stick. The next few hours would determine whether her experience could be transformed into meaningful reform or would simply become another forgotten incident in the long history of discrimination in commercial aviation. 2 weeks after the incident, Derek Washington sat in a sterile office in downtown Chicago facing Dr. Patricia Reeves for his third court-mandated counseling session. The federal charges against him had been reduced to misdemeanor destruction of property after Zara Mitchell's lawyers negotiated a plea agreement that emphasized rehabilitation over punishment. But Derek's career with the TSA was permanently over, and his future remained uncertain in ways that kept him awake most nights, staring at the ceiling of his studio apartment. Dr. Reeves was a patient woman in her 50s who specialized in helping law enforcement officers confront the prejudices that had led them into professional and legal trouble. And she had seen enough cases like Derek's to understand that real change required more than just acknowledging wrongdoing. It demanded a fundamental examination of the fears, insecurities, and learned behaviors that had shaped his worldview and led him to destroy another person's property because he couldn't accept that his assumptions might be wrong. "Derek," she said gently, "last week we talked about the moment when you decided to tear up Miss Mitchell's passport. I want to explore what you were feeling in that instant, what emotions and thoughts were driving your behavior." Derek shifted uncomfortably in his chair, still struggling with the requirement that he examine his own motivations rather than simply accepting punishment and moving on with his life. "I was angry," he admitted reluctantly. "She was challenging my authority, making me look like I didn't know how to do my job, and I just wanted to prove that I was right about her being a fraud." "But you knew the passport was genuine," Dr. Reeves pointed out. "Your training had taught you to recognize authentic documents, and you found no evidence of tampering or forgery, so what made you so certain that she was deceiving you?" The question forced Derek to confront the uncomfortable truth that his suspicions had been based on prejudice rather than professional expertise. She didn't look like someone who could afford a first-class ticket, he said finally. People who dress like they shop at thrift stores don't usually fly international business, and when I see something that doesn't add up, my job is to investigate until I figure out what's really going on. Dr. Reeves nodded thoughtfully. Tell me about your daughter, Derek. How do you think she would feel if someone treated her the way you treated Miss Mitchell, making assumptions about her capabilities based on her appearance? The comparison hit Derek like a physical blow because Keisha was 15 years old and had already experienced enough discrimination to make her careful about how she dressed, spoke, and carried herself in public. She was an honor student with dreams of becoming a doctor. But Derek had watched her confidence erode under the weight of teachers who assumed she was less intelligent than her white classmate store clerks who followed her through shopping malls and police officers who looked at her with suspicion rather than respect. That's different, Derek said, though his voice lacked conviction. Keisha is a good kid who works hard and follows the rules. She doesn't deserve to be treated badly. And what made you think that Ms. Mitchell deserved to be treated badly? Dr. Reeves asked. What evidence did you have that she was anything other than a successful professional traveling for business purposes? Derek couldn't answer the question honestly, without admitting that his judgment had been based entirely on racial and class prejudices, that he had learned growing up in neighborhoods where success was viewed with suspicion, and where any black person who seemed to be doing too well was automatically assumed to be involved in something illegal or fraudulent. He had spent his entire career in law enforcement telling himself that he was one of the good guys, but his treatment of Zara Mitchell had revealed the extent to which he had internalized the same toxic attitudes that had made his own life difficult. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Thomas Rivera was participating in a similar process of forced self-examination as part of the diversity training program that Skyline Airways had implemented in response to the discrimination incident. Unlike Derek, Thomas hadn't been arrested or charged with a crime, but his behavior toward Zara had cost him his position as senior cabin crew and placed him on unpaid leave, pending the completion of an extensive retraining program. The training sessions were conducted by Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a former flight attendant who had transitioned into diversity consulting after experiencing her own battles with discrimination in the airline industry. She understood the pressures and cultural dynamics that shaped crew behavior, but she also recognized that meaningful change required more than just lectures about proper customer service protocols. Thomas, she said during their individual counseling session, "You've worked very hard to achieve your position with this airline, and you clearly take pride in providing excellent service to passengers. Help me understand what was different about your interaction with Ms. Mitchell." Thomas struggled to articulate his motivations without revealing the class-based prejudices that had driven his behavior. "I've always believed that first-class service should maintain certain standards," he said carefully. When passengers don't dress appropriately or seem unfamiliar with premium service expectations, it can affect the experience for other customers who have paid substantial amounts for exclusive treatment. Dr. Martinez recognized the coded language that Thomas was using to justify his discrimination without explicitly acknowledging his prejudice. "Tell me about your own background, Thomas. What was your family's economic situation when you were growing up?" The question touched on painful memories that Thomas had spent years trying to overcome. His father had worked in a factory for 30 years before losing his job to corporate downsizing, and his mother had cleaned houses for wealthy families while struggling to afford decent clothes for her children. Thomas had learned early that appearance mattered, that people made judgments about worth and capability based on superficial characteristics, and that success required not only hard work, but also the ability to look and act like you belonged in spaces that were traditionally reserved for people from different backgrounds. "We didn't have much money," Thomas admitted. "I learned to recognize quality because my mother cleaned houses for people who had everything we couldn't afford. I worked hard to earn my position in this industry because I wanted to be part of something elegant and sophisticated, not just another working-class person serving people who were born with advantages I never had." Dr. Martinez nodded with understanding. "And when you saw Miss Mitchell in first class, what did that represent to you?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, processing emotions and memories that he had never examined closely. "I guess I was angry," he said finally. "Here was someone who looked like she came from the same kind of background I did, but she was sitting in a seat that costs more money than my father made in a month. It felt like she was getting something for free that I had to work 15 years to afford, and I resented her for it." The admission was painful but necessary, because it revealed the way Thomas had internalized societal messages about worth and deservedness, messages that had led him to police other people's access to privileges based on his own insecurities about class and status. His discrimination against Zara hadn't been motivated by racial prejudice, but by class resentment and the false belief that some people were more deserving of respect and service than others. Dr. Martinez helped Thomas understand that his anger had been misdirected, that the real problem wasn't passengers who didn't fit his expectations, but a society that made people like him feel that dignity and respect were luxuries to be rationed based on economic status and appearance. The solution wasn't to deny good service to people who reminded him of his own struggles, but to recognize that everyone deserved to be treated with courtesy and professionalism, regardless of their background or circumstances. Both Derek and Thomas were beginning to understand that their behavior toward Zara Mitchell had been symptoms of larger problems in their own thinking, problems that required ongoing work to address. The counseling sessions were uncomfortable and often painful, but they were also providing them with tools to recognize their own prejudices and make different choices in future interactions with people who challenged their assumptions about who belonged in certain spaces. 6 months after the incident, Zara Mitchell found herself sitting in a conference room at the Bridges Foundation, a nonprofit organization that specialized in facilitating difficult conversations about race, class, and privilege. She had agreed to participate in a mediated dialogue with Derek Washington and Thomas Rivera, not because she felt any obligation to forgive them, but because she believed that understanding the roots of discrimination was essential to preventing future incidents. The session was being facilitated by Dr. Elena Whitfield, a psychologist who had spent decades helping people navigate conversations about prejudice and harm. Eleanor Walsh was present as a witness and supporter, having insisted on participating despite her advanced age and the emotional difficulty of reliving the flight incident. The room was comfortable but formal, designed to encourage honest conversation while maintaining appropriate boundaries between people who had been on opposite sides of discriminatory encounters. Derek entered the room first, looking older than his 45 years, and carrying himself with the subdued manner of someone who had spent months confronting uncomfortable truths about his own behavior and motivations. The confident authority that had characterized his interactions with airport passengers had been replaced by genuine humility and the kind of careful self-awareness that came from extensive therapy and soul-searching. Thomas arrived a few minutes later, his appearance similarly transformed by months of introspection and education about the impact of his actions on other people. The proud professionalism that had defined his identity as senior cabin crew had evolved into something more thoughtful and empathetic, though Zara could see that he was still struggling with the shame of having behaved so badly toward a passenger who had done nothing to deserve his hostility. "Thank you all for being here." Dr. Whitfield began, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had mediated hundreds of similar conversations. "This dialogue is not about forgiveness or reconciliation, though those things may emerge naturally. Our goal is understanding, helping everyone involved gain insight into how discrimination operates and how we might prevent similar incidents in the future." Derek was the first to speak, his voice halting as he struggled to find words adequate to express his regret and his growing understanding of what he had done. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, looking directly at Zara for the first time since their confrontation at the airport, "I owe you an apology that goes beyond what I did to your passport. I destroyed federal property, but more importantly, I attacked your dignity and your right to travel without being harassed because of how you looked." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. The counseling sessions have helped me understand that my behavior wasn't really about security concerns or fraudulent documents. It was about my own insecurities and prejudices about the fact that seeing a successful black woman challenged my assumptions about who deserves respect and who belongs in certain spaces. Zara listened without responding immediately, studying Derek's face for signs of genuine remorse versus the kind of performed apology that people offered when they were trying to minimize consequences. But what she saw was authentic pain and self-awareness, the expression of someone who had genuinely grappled with his own demons and emerged with a different understanding of himself and the world around him. Thomas took longer to find his voice clearly struggling with emotions that were still raw and difficult to articulate. "Ms. Mitchell," he said finally, "what I did to you on that flight was cruel and unprofessional, and there's no excuse for it. I've spent months trying to understand why I treated you so badly, and the truth is that seeing you in first class triggered my own insecurities about class and worth." He looked down at his hands before continuing. "I grew up poor, and I learned to believe that respect and good treatment were things you had to earn through appearance and status. When I saw you in clothes that reminded me of my own struggles, I resented you for having access to privileges that I thought should be reserved for people who looked the part." Eleanor Walsh spoke up from her position as witness and supporter. "Young man," she said, with the moral authority that had made her such a powerful advocate during the flight incident, "what you're describing is not unique to you. Many people struggle with these feelings, but most of them don't assault passengers with beverages or deny basic service to paying customers." Thomas nodded, accepting the criticism without defensiveness. "You're absolutely right, and I'm not trying to excuse my behavior. I'm trying to understand it so that I can do better in the future. The diversity training has helped me see that my prejudices hurt not just the people I targeted, but also myself, because they prevented me from treating everyone with the dignity they deserve." Dr. Whitfield guided the conversation toward deeper exploration of the cultural and institutional factors that had contributed to the discrimination Zara experienced. Derek talked about the law enforcement culture that had taught him to view certain populations with suspicion, while Thomas described the airline industry's unspoken hierarchies that privileged certain types of passengers over others. Zara found herself sharing her own experiences with discrimination in corporate environments, describing the constant pressure of being seen as a diversity hire and the way that prejudice operated through assumptions about competence, qualifications, and deservedness. The conversation revealed how personal prejudices intersected with institutional biases to create environments where discrimination flourished even when official policies prohibited it. "What I've learned from this experience," Zara said toward the end of the session, "is that individual accountability is important, but it's not enough. We have to address the training policies and cultural messages that teach people to make assumptions about others based on appearance, race, and class." Derek and Thomas both nodded in agreement, and Dr. Whitfield noted that their willingness to engage in difficult self-examination was exactly the kind of personal work that needed to accompany broader institutional changes. The session ended without formal forgiveness or reconciliation, but with a shared understanding that discrimination was a problem that required ongoing attention and commitment from everyone involved. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor Walsh approached Derek and Thomas with the directness that had made her such an effective advocate. "I want you both to know," she said, "that your willingness to examine your own behavior gives me hope that other people can learn and change as well. But I also want you to understand that the real test will be how you handle similar situations in the future when no one is watching, and when it would be easier to fall back into old patterns." Both men nodded soberly, understanding that their participation in the dialogue was only the beginning of a longer process of personal growth and professional development that would require sustained effort and vigilance against their own biases and prejudices. 1 year after the incident that had transformed her understanding of her own company's culture, Zara Mitchell stood at the podium of the International Aviation Customer Service Conference in London, preparing to deliver a keynote address that would detail the comprehensive reforms she had implemented at Skyline Airways. The audience included airline executives, government regulators, and customer service professionals from around the world, all eager to hear how a discrimination crisis had been transformed into an industry-leading model for respectful passenger treatment. The changes at Skyline Airways had been swift, comprehensive, and remarkably effective. Customer satisfaction scores had increased by 47% in the past year, while discrimination complaints had dropped to virtually zero through a combination of enhanced training, clear policies, and accountability measures that made it clear that prejudicial treatment of passengers would result in immediate termination. The airline had also implemented a passenger advocate program inspired by Eleanor Walsh's intervention during the flight incident that provided travelers with a clear path for reporting discrimination and seeking resolution. Ladies and gentlemen, Zara began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had earned her authority through both success and suffering. 1 year ago, I experienced discrimination at the hands of my own employees because they made assumptions about my worthiness based on my appearance and background. Today, I want to share with you how that painful experience became the catalyst for transforming not just my company, but our entire approach to customer service. She clicked to her first slide, which showed side-by-side statistics comparing Skyline Airways' performance before and after the implementation of dignity-based service protocols. The numbers were impressive, but more importantly, they represented hundreds of thousands of passengers who were now treated with respect, regardless of their appearance, accent, or perceived social status. Derek Washington was in the audience, having been hired by Skyline Airways as a diversity trainer specializing in unconscious bias education for security and customer service personnel. His transformation from aggressive TSA officer to thoughtful educator had been remarkable, and his willingness to share his own story of prejudice and redemption had made him an effective advocate for change within the law enforcement and aviation security communities. My role now, Derek had explained to a group of TSA supervisors during a recent training session, is to help other officers recognize the prejudices that I allowed to destroy my career and hurt innocent people. When I see someone who doesn't fit my expectations for a particular type of passenger, my job is to examine my assumptions rather than harassing them for not conforming to my biases. Thomas Rivera had also found redemption through service, though his path had been different from Derek's. After completing his diversity training and anger management counseling, he had been offered a position with the Skyline Airways Customer Service Excellence Team, where he used his experience with both discrimination and premium hospitality to train flight crews about treating all passengers with dignity and respect. Every passenger who boards our aircraft, Thomas had told a group of new flight attendants during their orientation, deserves to be treated like the most important person on the plane, regardless of what they're wearing, how they sound, or where they came from. My job is to make sure you understand that courtesy and professionalism are not luxuries to be rationed based on ticket price or appearance. Eleanor Walsh had become the unofficial spokesperson for the Passenger Advocate Program, using her status as a longtime premium customer to champion the rights of travelers who might not have the resources or influence to fight discrimination on their own. At 83 years old, she approached her advocacy work with the energy of someone who had found renewed purpose in fighting injustice wherever she encountered it. "Age has given me the freedom to speak truth to power," Eleanor had said during a recent television interview about discrimination in travel. "When I see someone being mistreated because they don't fit someone else's narrow expectations, I'm going to speak up, and I'm going to keep speaking up until the mistreatment stops." As Zara concluded her keynote address, she reflected on the personal growth that had accompanied her professional achievements. The insecure executive who had felt compelled to go undercover to prove her worthiness had evolved into a confident leader who understood that vulnerability and authenticity were sources of strength rather than weakness. She had learned that effective leadership required not just business acumen, but also the courage to confront uncomfortable truths about institutional prejudice and the commitment to create change even when it was difficult or costly. The lesson I want to leave you with today, Zara said to the conference audience, is that discrimination is not an inevitable byproduct of human nature or business necessity. It's a choice, and it's a choice that we can decide to stop making. When we treat every customer with dignity and respect, we don't just improve their experience. We improve our own humanity and create the kind of world we want to live in. The standing ovation that followed was sustained and heartfelt. But Zara's satisfaction came not from the applause, but from knowing that the changes she had implemented would prevent other passengers from experiencing the humiliation and discrimination that had marked her own journey. The torn passport still hung in her office, not as a trophy of victory, but as a reminder that justice required constant vigilance, and that transformation was always possible for those willing to do the hard work of examining their own prejudices and changing their behavior accordingly. After the conference, Zara visited her father in Chicago, bringing him to see the new Skyline Airways training facility, where Derek Thomas and dozens of other employees were learning to recognize and combat discrimination in all its forms. Charles Mitchell walked through the facility with obvious pride, stopping to chat with trainees who were eager to learn from his decades of experience in aviation customer service. "You know, baby girl," he said as they stood in the observation area, watching a role-playing exercise designed to help employees recognize unconscious bias when I told you to go undercover and see how your own people treated you. I never imagined it would lead to all this. Zara smiled, remembering the conversation in his kitchen that had started her on this journey of discovery and transformation. "The best part," she said, "is that we're not just changing how one airline treats its passengers. We're creating a model that other companies can follow. And we're proving that treating people with dignity isn't just morally right. It's also good business." As they watched Derek facilitate a discussion about the impact of prejudice on customer experience, Zara realized that the true measure of her success wasn't the awards on her wall or the positive media coverage of Skyline Airways' transformation. It was the knowledge that discrimination would be less likely to flourish in environments where people had been taught to recognize their biases and make conscious choices about treating others with respect and dignity. The journey from that torn passport to this moment of institutional change had been difficult, painful, and often frustrating. But it had also been necessary, and it had proven that even the most entrenched patterns of prejudice could be transformed through commitment, courage, and the willingness to do the hard work of creating a more just and equitable world. 6 months later, industry-wide changes in discrimination reporting and training programs reflected the impact of Skyline Airways' transformation, with other airlines implementing similar dignity-based service protocols and bias training requirements. Derek's daughter Keisha, now a senior in high school, told her classmates about her father's journey from prejudice to understanding breaking cycles of discrimination in her own generation through honest conversations about growth and accountability. Thomas mentors young flight attendants from diverse backgrounds at the new Skyline Airways Training Center, teaching them that exceptional service means treating every passenger with equal dignity regardless of their appearance or perceived status. Eleanor Walsh's Passenger Advocate Program has expanded to rail travel hotels and other service industries, creating a network of witnesses willing to speak up when they see discrimination occurring. Zara keeps the original torn passport framed in her office, not as a trophy of victory, but as a reminder that lasting change happens through understanding rather than punishment, one conversation and one human connection at a time. Real transformation requires the courage to examine our own biases and the commitment to choose dignity over prejudice, even when no one is watching.